This is Goss's Garage with Pat Goss, co-host of PBS's Motor Week. He'll take your calls and comments now at 844-885-4677 or email him at radio@goss-garage.com. And now, Pat Goss.
Hi everybody, welcome to Goss's Garage. Now, every week I get oil questions like this one. The guy who changes my oil says I should be using thicker oil in my car. Now, I trust him, but I don't know about this advice. Now, what should I do? Well, it seems far too many people who change oil know more than the engineers who design engines. These morons keep telling drivers to use thicker oil for better protection, but better protection doesn't come from thicker or thinner oil. It comes from the right oil, the oil the engine was designed to use. Now, don't be a moron and do it, because two morons don't make a genius. And changing oil, no matter how many times anyone does it, won't magically morph them from oil changer to oil engineer or chemist. Nor will changing oil teach anyone the steps used in a refinery to change crude oil or synthetics into something that can protect the parts inside your engine. Protection during cold starts and blazing hot days in traffic and every situation in between. Sadly, changing oil will not make a tech into a metallurgist that can study the amount of expansion of engine parts as it heats up. Nope, changing oil or even repairing engines won't give anyone the knowledge necessary to make recommendations to switch from the oil recommended by the manufacturer to something not recommended by the manufacturer. The primary job of oil in an engine is to keep moving parts from touching one another. This is done by means of a thin film of oil in gaps between parts that keeps them from touching. But here's the rub. As engines have become more precise due to sophisticated computer-controlled machining, the space or gap for the film of oil has become smaller. This means these engines need thinner oil to pass through those smaller gaps and still provide the film of oil necessary to keep parts from touching. Also, nearly all engines these days have variable valve timing, which works off oil pressure. Changing to a thicker oil changes the pressure needed to move oil through the engine. That increase in oil pressure can confuse the car's computer, which controls the variable valve timing, leading to lowered performance, lower gas mileage, or in some cases even a check engine light. Bottom line, changing oil or repairing cars did not give anyone, myself included, the knowledge to determine if a change in oil thickness will be good, bad, or indifferent for any engine. In other words, don't reinvent the wheel. The manufacturer has spent millions in testing and engineering to determine the right oil for your car. Did the person changing your oil spend millions of dollars to develop their suggestions, or is it just mental fantasy or outdated wacko bull? Unless the vehicle manufacturer issues a bulletin telling you to do something different, always use the oil recommended in your owner's manual. Very few people are smarter than the engineers who designed the engine, and typically they won't be changing your oil. For more car tips, tricks, and money-saving ideas, check out goss-garage.com. All right, oil, what a boondoggle that seems to be. Of all of the topics on an automobile, oil is probably the number one. And I get all of these questions about, can I put synthetic in my older car? Yes, certainly you can. There isn't any mileage where you can or can't. A lot of people say, can I put synthetic in my new car? Yes, you can. Most new cars, a lot of new cars use synthetic, and they come from the factory with synthetic. Because these myths that you hear about an engine won't break in or things like that if you put synthetic in it, not true. If that was the case, virtually every Mercedes in the last, 15, 20 years would never have broken in because they come from the factory with Mobil 1. A lot of Chrysler Corporation cars and so on come with Mobil 1 in them. So, yes, you can put synthetic in a brand new car. Technically, though, what I would do if you're going to change to synthetic is that I would wait for the first oil change. Why take brand new oil, drain it out of the car, and then put more brand new oil back in? The difference in wear or anything like that through one oil change is not going to warrant the extra cost. So go to the first scheduled oil change, which typically is going to be 5,000 miles, drain the original oil out, and then refill it with synthetic, and you have just done your changeover to synthetic. So that's the way I approach that. Doesn't make any sense to do it any other way as far as I'm concerned. The other things with synthetic oils, as long as we're talking about synthetics, they do not necessarily increase the amount of time the oil can stay in the car. Now, I understand if you look at a bottle of Mobil 1 extended service or something like that, I understand that it says can be used up to 15,000 miles or whatever. Well, that typically means that it is compatible with the specifications for some of the cars, like some of the Mercedes and some of the BMWs and so on, that have 10, 12, 15,000 mile oil change intervals. The car was designed to have that longer interval, so therefore you need an oil that will match that. That does not mean that you can take a synthetic oil, put it into a car that doesn't or wasn't designed for an extended oil change interval, and that it'll last that long. And why is real simple. How long oil lasts in an engine is determined by how dirty the engine is inside. Not so much that it has sludge or anything like that, but that a lot of cars will allow more byproducts of combustion to go past the piston rings down into the crankcase than other engines. In other words, some engines are tighter than others. Now, we see cars in here that come in, we put fresh, clean amber oil in it. 500 miles, the oil is jet black. Does it mean something's wrong? No, not necessarily. I mean, it could if the car has other problems, but oven by itself, all that means is that soot from the burning of the fuel, which produces this black carbon soot, that soot is getting into the oil. It's going down past the pistons. It's being forced past the pistons during the compression stroke when they're compressing the fuel and air inside the cylinder. So there's a lot of pressure on it at that point. And there's pressure during the power stroke, which is when the fuel burns and pushes the piston down, and some of that burning fuel goes past the piston rings down into the crankcase. Now, like I say, that doesn't necessarily mean there's any problem with the engine or anything of the kind, but that sort of thing is what determines how long oil can stay in the car, how much moisture builds up in the crankcase of a given car. That has a big effect on how long the oil can stay in the car. So it isn't the oil that you put into the car, it is the design of the car and the oiling system that determines how long oil can stay. So you put 15,000 mile oil in your car, doesn't mean that it's going to last 15,000 miles if you happen to have a dirty engine. So keep that in mind. the manufacturer's recommended oil change interval is going to be your guide. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, I don't know why everybody that drives an automobile is optimistic. They look at these oil change intervals or other service intervals on the car. Oil change can be up to 10,000 miles. All things being perfect, up to 10,000 miles. That doesn't mean it's going to go 10,000 miles. That doesn't mean it should go 10,000 miles between oil changes. It just means that if everything works exactly the way it should, it could go that long. So big difference between will and could. Now, I, for years, have driven Mercedes, and they're usually 10,000 mile oil changes. I never go that long. I go 6,000 to 7,500. And that's the other thing you have to keep in mind. You're optimistic about the oil change interval. You're going to push it right to the absolute maximum, and then you're going to get busy. And oh gosh, I can't go to the oil change place today. And today becomes tomorrow, and tomorrow becomes next week, and next week becomes next month. And all of a sudden you're 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 miles beyond the maximum. Beyond the maximum that was allowed. You know, so if you do it early and you schedule it early, then when life gets in the way of having all of this done, you're not in serious trouble and you're not likely to destroy your engine. All right, we need to take a break. We'll be right back.
Stay tuned. Pat will take your calls next at 844-885-4677. Goss's Garage continues in a moment.
How quickly we forget. We're right back to using short-term logic to make long-term purchases. There's a huge increase in sales of big, thirsty vehicles. Trucks, SUVs, and other vehicles with dismal gas mileage are selling like hotcakes. Yes, they're wonderful, but can your budget support such a thirsty beast when gas prices go back to $4 a gallon? Did you plan on that? On the plus side, if you're considering a thrifty car, you might get a real deal. With so many drivers ignoring reality, there are more hybrid and plug-ins in stock. Traditionally, hybrids have not been a great deal because when gas prices are sky high, everyone wants one, which pushes their prices up, sometimes so high that you might have to pay over window sticker to get a hybrid or a plug-in. But higher purchase prices mean it can take years to break even through savings at the pump. It has taken many drivers so long to break even that trade-in time came before they broke even. But cheaper gas zaps hybrid demand, and less demand can mean a better deal. So if you've been thinking about an economy car, now might be the time. That's using long-term logic to buy a long-term product. That's smart. Life changes at a ferocious pace these days, especially when it comes to maintaining our cars. For example, automatic transmissions now need regular fluid flushes. Transmission fluid breaks down with use, and although it may look fine, its additives wear out and it can no longer properly protect bands, clutches, seals, and other hugely expensive parts inside your transmission. Bottom line, more wear and a shorter transmission life. Now you can significantly extend transmission life with a BG transmission flush every 24 to 30,000 miles or 2 years. BG makes the best transmission flush machine I've ever tested. It renews all of the fluid in your transmission, not just a small part of it. The BG transmission flush machine is safe, too, because it uses the natural circulation of the transmission. Your transmission will work better and last longer. As with everything BG offers, this is a superior service. For more information, go to bgprod.com or bgfindashop.com.
This is Goss's Garage with Pat Goss. Call the show now at 844-885-4677.
Hey folks, make sure to subscribe to the Goss's Garage radio show on YouTube, where you can find tips and tricks to save you time and avoid headaches. All right, we'll go back to oil and so on in a minute. We have some emails here. This one is about a Chevy S10. My 97 Chevy S10 truck has 153,000 miles on it. I smell gas every time I drive this truck. Could not find any visible gas leaks. And that's a big thing, folks. Most gas leaks are not visible. Everybody that, and a lot of techs do this, people expect that you're going to see dripping gasoline someplace. Well, a lot of these gas leaks that we find are not dripping gasoline. But anyway, let's see. No visible gas leaks under the hood, around the engine. But the gas smell is very noticeable to anyone inside the cabin while driving. So any advice on what to do? And this is from Ed. Well, Ed, let me tell you, this is an S10. I am presuming that it is probably a Vortec engine. And if it is a Vortec engine, the very first thing that you want to do is to check the injector, the central injector. A lot of people refer to it as a spider that is under the intake manifold, or the air plenum. These things, they have a central injector, and the central injector is triggered, and then it has 6 little tubes with poppet injectors on the ends of them, and those tubes get to leaking, and lots of times we will pull the air plenum apart on those, and there'll be 2 quarts of gasoline down inside the intake where this central injector is leaking. So that's where I would start. I'd look at that that spider in there and see if it is leaking. If so, you have to replace the whole assembly. I don't know what they're going for now. A couple of years ago, they were $660 plus labor. So they're not cheap by any stretch of the imagination. But that's where you start on an S10, because they just, they have huge problems with that. All right, let's see here. All right, we have another one. This is from Lee. I was looking back at the EPA numbers for the first Chevy S10 pickups. I missed my S10. I noted that the EPA numbers were 28 city and 39 highway. All right, so, let's see here. Chevrolet was the first domestic pickup manufacturer to introduce a compact pickup when it added the new S10 pickups in '82. All right, let's get to the point here. EPA rating, 28 miles per gallon, 39 on the highway, okay. So I'm saying to myself, that was in '82. Have we made any progress at all? Yeah, I think we have. I didn't realize that EPA tests have changed many times over the years. Yes, they have. They've been updated to make them more realistic. Back in '82, they weren't realistic at all. In many cases, you were lucky if you got 50% of what the EPA rating was, and that led to all kinds of complaints from manufacturers and dealers. So, an S10 rated for 39, you probably would be lucky to get 20, and I can attest to that. All right, Lee says I had 92 S10 2.5 with a stick shift, and I think I got 29 miles to the gallon on a trip. Well, yeah, sure. Lots of things can affect it on a single trip. What you need to know is what you get overall on a vehicle, not on one trip. because depending on traffic, depending on wind, if you've got a tailwind, that can make a huge difference in the mileage as opposed to a headwind where you have to push through the wind harder. You've got wind pushing you, so on. So, yeah, you might get that. But I can tell you, I owned an 82 S10, owned it for 12 or 13 years, and best I ever got on it. Of course, I never took a trip to Richmond or anything like that in it because it really wasn't a highway vehicle. But be that as it may, my overall average for the 13 or so years that I owned that vehicle with highway use and city use and so on was about 18 miles to the gallon. And I was pleased with that. That's what it was. Lee says, I typically do just a little better than EPA in my '02 Nissan Frontier, except when I run the AC. The AC eats a lot of gas. They do on some cars. '02 is going back a ways, so that's a 15-year-old vehicle. AC compressors and everything have improved dramatically over the years. So, they're not nearly as thirsty when it comes to fuel to make them work and so on. Now, I like to ride around with the windows down when it is warm. I noticed that almost nobody does that anymore. All the new cars have their windows up all the time in temperatures of 75 and above. The old ones have windows because the AC is likely broken, whatever. Maybe everyone keeps the windows up on new cars because the aerodynamics of the car make having windows down uncomfortable. No, not that having the windows down makes the car uncomfortable. Having the windows down wastes fuel on most cars. Yes, they're aerodynamic. And up to about 25 miles an hour, you can save fuel on most cars by turning the AC off and rolling the windows down. But when you get beyond 25 or 30 miles an hour, then rolling the windows down disturbs the airflow around the vehicle, and it actually takes more fuel to move that car with the windows down than it would with the windows up and the air conditioning on. Plus, for most people, it's more comfortable. So, it's just a lot of this is perception and so on. But I got to tell you, as far as air conditioning these days, much more efficient than than what most people think. We think of windows down, that we turn the air conditioning off. Well, back in the day, an air conditioning compressor was a real thirsty critter. Most of them had a lot of drag on the engine and so on. And then, that led to fuel consumption. Today, not so much. And speaking of air conditioning, if you have a late model car, before you take it in to have any kind of air conditioning work done on it, make sure that you know that the shop has the equipment for the new 1, 2, 3, 4 refrigerant that is being used. There's a new refrigerant in a lot of cars. I think Chrysler's had it in some of their cars for a year, maybe 2 now. Other manufacturers are changing over. It requires special equipment, and the shop has to have all this special equipment in order to be able to work on those systems. So make it complicated? Oh, yeah, absolutely. So let's keep that in mind as well. And we'll talk more about this changeover to this new air conditioning refrigerant in a later show. We'll dedicate a show to it. All right, back to the oil. A lot of things that people don't realize as far as oil is concerned is that when you change to this thicker oil, and things I didn't go into in that opening segment, as we go to a thicker oil, it takes more pressure to move it between these parts. You see, when they build an engine, they leave a certain amount of space between the parts. That space determines the thickness of the oil that is best in that engine, because the oil has to fill that space with a film of oil and keep these parts from touching one another. All right, so as engines have advanced, we've gone from old-timey machining and so on to CNC and computer-controlled and all of this stuff, which is far, far more precise. And some of the tolerances in these engines today are 10 times more precise than they were 20 or 30 years ago. So we've got a small gap on a lot of these cars, let's say between the connecting rod and the crankshaft. Need a relatively lightweight or thin oil to move through that and to build the film that's necessary to hold the two parts from touching one another. All right, so now let's say this car requires a 0W20, real popular oil these days. And technicians say, oh my goodness, yeah, that thin oil, it's terrible. Well, why is it terrible? What are you basing this on? Are there wholesale engine failures out there? If there were, there would be recalls, there would be all kinds of bulletins and so on, but there aren't. There aren't huge, huge numbers of engines failing. So where does the guy changing the oil come up with this? Other than the fact, oh gosh, thick oil, it's got to be better. Well, let's take that 020 out and let's put some 530 in it. What's going to happen? The very first thing when we start it, and remember that upwards of 90% of all of the wear that happens on an engine happens during and immediately following startup. So we want lubrication just as quick as we can get it when we first start the engine, because that accounts for the vast, vast majority of all of the wear that will ever occur on our engines. All right, so now we take the 020 out and we put 530 in. Now that 5 weight is thicker when the engine is cold, and that slows down the movement of the oil through the engine. So that means it's going to take longer for oil to get through all of the things that need to be lubricated. And that means we're going to get more wear. Then, as the engine warms up, the oil assumes the characteristics of a 30 weight oil, a thicker oil. Now we got all these tight tolerances in there. So now we've got a little teeny tolerance, little space in there. We try to push this thick oil through, and the thick oil can't move through as effectively. So it kind of, it's dammed up on the incoming side of each one of the bearings. Well, that makes everything work harder, and the oil pump has to work harder, and that decreases fuel economy and so on. That increases oil pressure, and when we increase oil pressure, we may upset the variable valve timing and stuff like that that relies on a specific oil pressure at a certain engine RPM and so on. So we can have performance, we can have fuel mileage problems, we can have check engine lights, we can have all kinds of things going on as a result of that. But more important is that if you stop and think about it, you have coolant in the radiator. Now, coolant in the radiator cools the engine block and the cylinder heads because there are coolant passages in there. But you can't mix coolant with the oil. So down in the crankcase where the crankshaft and the connecting rods and all of this stuff is, anything that has oil is not cooled by coolant. It is cooled by oil. That is the sole coolant for the crankshaft bearings, and all of these things. So now, with this thicker oil, we're going to slow down the movement of that oil, very critical oil that has to lubricate and has to cool these parts that if we don't keep them cool with oil, they get blazing hot. And literally, when that happens inside an engine, metal will melt. We sometimes have engines come in where they've been run low on oil, and literally the steel and the aluminum and so on, the bearing material, all of that has just melted because of the heat. So there's a tremendous amount of heat. All right, so we're going to cut down on the oil flow, which means that every one of those lubricated parts is going to run hotter. Hotter means more wear. More wear means shorter life. So what have we actually accomplished here? Well, we've shot ourselves in the foot because we haven't increased the life of the engine. We've decreased the life of the engine. We haven't added to fuel economy. We've detracted from fuel economy. We haven't added horsepower because it takes more power to drive the oil pump when these things are, when you have the thicker oil in there. And the list goes on and on. Now, the tech that says that thicker oil is always better is wrong. Just pure, plain wrong. So, you know, the people that design these engines put a lot of effort into it and millions of miles of testing and so on, and they know what works. Now, granted, if you're going to go to the racetrack and you're going to modify the engine and do things like that, then yeah, you may want to change viscosity. But for our daily drivers, we commute in and things like that, we don't want to change the thickness of the oil that goes into the engine because it isn't going to help the engine. More in a moment.
Operators are standing by to take your call for Pat at 844-885-4677. Goss's Garage continues in a moment.
Think you'll get a deal buying a used car from an individual instead of a dealer? Possibly, but there's a good chance you'll get taken if you wind up dealing with a curbstoner. Curbstoners are low-life scum who buy cars with problems, cobble them together, roll back the miles, make them look good, and resell them. They usually claim the car belonged to a friend or relative, and there's a sad story about a death, financial woes, illness, or other tragedy. If you buy from one of these crooks, you'll probably get a great-looking car, but in poor mechanical or body condition at a slightly lower price. But you won't get a warranty or a good, reliable car. Curbstoner cars are often so bad they only have scrap value. There are curbstoner cars all over the internet, in nearly every shopping center and sitting along the road. Total loss, flood cars are a curbstoner favorite because there are tens of thousands of them and they're easy to disguise. So when buying off the street, question everything. When was the title issued? Is it in the seller's name? Does it show the seller's proper address? Is it from another state? Of course, always have a shop check any used car and get a Carfax vehicle history report before paying a dime. Curbstoners are crooks who will happily steal your money. So be really careful. I get lots of questions about BG products, many about specific products or services like, is BG44K really that good, or are BG transmission, cooling system, and power steering flushes actually necessary? But most popular of all, do I use BG products in my cars? Well, the answer to all of those questions is yes. A regular schedule of BG flushes and chemicals will deliver the longest possible life from all the lubricated and fuel delivery parts on your vehicles. And do I use BG products? You bet I do. I drive nice cars, and I drive a lot. Plus, my live radio and TV shows mean that my cars have to be absolutely reliable. A no start from dirty fuel injectors or a failed transmission just isn't acceptable in my life. Remember, deposits and dirty fluids ruin expensive parts. For reliability like I demand, visit one of the quality shops that sell BG products and perform BG services. To find a BG professional near you, bgfindashop.com.
Now, back to Goss's Garage with your host, Pat Goss.
Folks, for more information on today's topic or any topic about buying, repairing, or selling an automobile, visit goss-garage.com or call our 24-hour listener line at 844-885-4677. All right, now, Anthony writes, I wanted to get your opinion on piston slap. In my case, it presents as a knocking noise that only occurs in winter months when the engine is cold. It goes away as the engine warms up. I have no performance issues at all. This is a 2004 Subaru Forester with 103,000 miles with good oil change history. I like the car and would otherwise keep it. I do not mind this noise, but want to know if you feel this sort of thing is a harmless noise, consistent with age, and not a more serious and detrimental condition before I spend any more money on the car. All right, well, Anthony, piston slap is real simple. Connecting rods come up to the piston, or in your case, it's a pancake boxer engine, and the pistons are laying on their side like this, and two over here and two over here. Now, what goes on here is real simple. As the crankshaft turns, it turns in an arc, and the connecting rod that connects the crankshaft to the piston, that means that the crankshaft end of it moves up and down. It rocks. So in the piston, we have to have a device, it's called a wrist pin, that allows the other end of the connecting rod to move up and down inside the piston. Well, piston slap occurs when that wrist pin seizes up, and as the crankshaft turns and the connecting rod moves back and forth, up and down in this case on the boxer engine, it is bound up inside the piston, and it causes the piston to rock back and forth. And piston slap is when the skirt of the piston, the body of the piston, is knocking up, down against the cylinder wall. Well, depending how bad it is, this can be pretty detrimental. It could lead to complete engine failure if it gets bad enough. Now, the first thing that we have to make sure is it indeed piston slap? We don't see that many problems with piston slap. Now, what we do see, we see a few Subarus with it, but what we see a lot more of are failed valve lifters in Subarus. So I would certainly make sure that the diagnosis is correct. And if the diagnosis is correct and it is piston slap, I'd monitor it very closely. I'd also do one other thing. I'd have a BG performance oil change performed on it. Now, that sounds like a screwball name, and I wholly agree it is a screwball name. What this amounts to is a very effective means of cleaning the inside of the engine, because there's a chemical that goes in that attacks gum and varnish and stuff like that. And that's what causes piston slap, because varnish builds up on the wrist pin and it causes the connecting rod to bind to the wrist pin. And all of this, because this is mostly varnish that causes this, the BG Performance Oil Change, that chemical that goes in, attacks this stuff, cleans it up, and lots of times corrects these problems. We've had tremendous luck with it on all sorts of problems. The Hondas that burn a quart of oil every 75 to 100 miles. The Cadillacs that do the same thing. Lots of times we do this BG Performance Oil Change, and we bring most of the Hondas back to where they're using a quart of oil every 2,000 miles or so. Same with the Cadillacs. So, that is one thing that I would do. If that doesn't help it, then the next thing to do is just to monitor it. Because typically, if it starts getting worse, it will be louder or it will last longer. The engine will have to run longer before the noise goes away. So those are things that you have to consider. And if it gets a lot louder and takes a lot longer to go away or doesn't go away at all, then what you want to do is consider that maybe it's time. Now, there's one other thing here. Depending on the grade of gas and depending on how frequently you use a commercial, now, I'm not talking about over-the-counter fuel system cleaner. Most of those over-the-counter products compared to a commercial product are very weak. Now, manufacturers have to look toward liability on things. Do these over-the-counter products work? Yeah, but it's a minimal amount. And the reason for that is that most any manufacturer these days knows that so many of you are morons because you don't read and follow label directions. So it tells you to put X amount in. You say, okay, well, I'll put that in. It didn't work. So now we're going to add more. And still isn't working, so we're going to add more. And time you get all done, what you wind up with is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 times the safe amount. So compared to a commercial product, a lot of the over-the-counter products, they were, there's just no comparison. So here again, the commercial product that I use is BG44K. Now, why am I telling you this? Because what is misinterpreted for piston slap is frequently carbon on the tops of the pistons. And this carbon builds up, and when you first start the engine, it actually hits the underside of the cylinder head, and you get the same clunk clunk that you would get with a wrist pin, because usually it'll be on one edge of the piston and it will cause the piston to rock just like a wrist pin would. So, the BG44K, that cleans away this carbon and does away with the issue. Again, GM, middle to late 90s, I guess, had a huge problem on some of their LS engines where it would build up carbon on the top of the piston and it created piston slap. And it was just about every one of them did it. And GM replaced a lot of engines and they tore a lot of engines down, did all kinds of things to them. But we, here in the shop, we found that using the BG44K in the fuel system, sometimes a couple of applications, that it would remove that carbon and do away with the piston slap. So that's something else to consider. And So that's something else to consider there, because carbon is very, very common and much more common in some parts of the country than the other because of fuel quality and different things like that. But my recommendation is to use BG44K every 7,500 miles to keep all these carbon deposits and everything under control. Does an amazing job. So that's my take on piston slap. Hope that gives you something to go by. All right, we need to take a break. We'll be right back on Goss's Garage.
Stay tuned. Pat will take your calls next at 844-885-4677. That's 844-885-GOSS. Goss's Garage continues in a moment.
Life changes at a ferocious pace these days, especially when it comes to maintaining our cars. For example, automatic transmissions now need regular fluid flushes. Transmission fluid breaks down with use, and although it may look fine, its additives wear out and it can no longer properly protect bands, clutches, seals, and other hugely expensive parts inside your transmission. Bottom line, more wear and a shorter transmission life. Now you can significantly extend transmission life with a BG transmission flush every 24 to 30,000 miles or 2 years. BG makes the best transmission flush machine I've ever tested. It renews all of the fluid in your transmission, not just a small part of it. The BG transmission flush machine is safe too, because it uses the natural circulation of the transmission. Your transmission will work better and last longer. As with everything BG offers, this is a superior service. For more information, go to bgprod.com or bgfindashop.com. Don't fall victim to "it looks good, therefore it must be good." Like when thump bump you're tapped by another car at a traffic light or in a parking lot. You get out and look, and being a good person, yeah, right. You just don't want the hassle of calling the cops and your insurance company. Plus, you don't even see a scratch, so you let it go. That could be a minor to deadly mistake. What you see is purely cosmetic, but hidden behind the cosmetics are safety systems. Those hidden parts absorb and dissipate energy, and they may have been damaged in that tiny bump. The problem is that unless you have energy absorbers and crumple zones checked, they may not protect you if your car is hit again in the same spot. Most safety parts are one-time use, and that first minor bump may have used up a portion of their effectiveness. Then, in an actual accident, they're only partially effective. For instance, the energy absorber may transmit more of the crash energy into the car and the people in the car. That could mean the difference between no or minor injuries or something worse, especially for young or elderly passengers. Even in bumps that seem like a total non-issue, take a minute to exchange information, then have the safety parts behind the bumper checked. It might save a life.
This is Goss's Garage with Pat Goss. Call the show now at 844-885-4677. That's 844-885-GOSS. And now, Pat Goss.
Remember, for more information on today's topic or any topic about buying, repairing, or selling an automobile, visit goss-garage.com or call our 24-hour listener line at 844-885-4677. Just got an email from Lee. He says, I just got home at 1:20. Not sure if I'm hearing a live broadcast. The stream is not very intelligible. It's repeating, hopping, then going dead air for 10 seconds, then popping on again and stuttering. Not sure if it's just my computer. Hey, folks, if any of you are having problems like that, let us know. Send us a message at radio at goss-garage.com, and we will check it out and so on. All right, back to oils. You know, there's another thing that determines how long oil can stay in a car, and that is the design of the oil filter and the whole filtering system, the screens and all of this other stuff. So, like I said earlier, just because you put an oil in it that is capable of going 15,000 miles or 12,000 miles or whatever its rating is, doesn't mean it can do that in each and every car. So I guess the bottom line here, when it comes to oil, why? Why do so many of you avoid it so? You know, you'll go out and you'll spend $2 or $3 grand on an extended warranty. Then you'll do the cheap thing on the oil changes, or you'll skip them altogether. Well, first, you may void your extended warranty by doing that, because any warranty, whether it's the original warranty or an extended warranty, requires that you take proper care of the car. And that means that you have to change the oil pretty consistently with what the owner's manual recommends. And that will protect your warranty. So you need to do that. You need to keep receipts on everything. Keep receipts on the oil changes and all the rest of it so that you have documentation. The receipts should give the date. You can fill in the mileage on the car. You then have the date, the product that was purchased, the quantity of the product purchased, and so on, so that you can show that you did what was required for the warranty. So this business of going long intervals between oil changes is horrible. Now, another thing. So many of you rely on these stinking oil change monitors. Now, a lot of you seem to think that these monitors check the condition of the oil. Maybe 1 or 2% of them do in a vague sort of way, but by and large, they do not check the condition of the oil. Now, if you want to prove that, you got an oil change monitor that comes up, tells you it's time to change the oil. You change the oil, you put fresh oil in it. Does it, the fresh oil, erase the message? No. You got to go through all kinds of hoops in order to do that. So, fact is that these systems do not know the condition of the oil. How do they work? Well, they count the number of revolutions of the engine. And they look at the temperature, either of the oil, of the coolant, or of the oil and the coolant. And they look at throttle settings and different things like that. But basically, they're counting the number of revolutions and the temperature during each one of those revolutions. And as these numbers mount up, they're plugged into an algorithm inside the computer, and when the two lines cross, it says, oh, time to change the oil. So the fact of the matter is that on many of these systems, you could have a car that idled a lot that would require an oil change a lot quicker than one that didn't idle a lot just because of the way the algorithm works. But the bottom line is, if you're relying on this to determine when your oil is worn out, that isn't going to tell you. All it is doing is guessing at when it should be worn out. It doesn't know that maybe you went on vacation and you drove on hundreds of miles of dirt roads and so on, sightseeing and things like that. And all this crud from the dust and so on got into the engine. It doesn't know that. It doesn't know any of these factors that can cause oil to go bad. Doesn't know that there's moisture building up in the oil because you haven't driven, your trips haven't been long enough to evaporate the moisture. Doesn't know any of that. So the best thing to do, if you really want to keep a car for a long time and you want to keep the engine going strong, is to change oil based on either time or mileage. Now, mileage, 5,000 or 6,000 miles. Some cars, maybe you could go 7,500, but the ideal 5,000 or 6,000 miles. Mileage or time? Well, time, if you do almost no driving, just a few hundred miles, less than 1,000 miles a year, once a year. But if you do 1,000 to 3,000 miles or so in a year's time, you want to change it every 6 months. So 6 months or 6,000 miles, that is usually a good number. And remember, if you're like all the rest of the world, myself included, you know, I own 2 repair shops. Am I able to get my car in there on the stroke of 6,000 miles? Oh, hell no. Not even close sometimes. Because 6,000 for me usually means 6,500 to 7,000 or thereabouts, because life, like I said earlier in the show, life gets in the way. And, you know, I'm over a little bit, so I take that into account, and that's the way I go about doing it. So, all right. Let's see. Please help me understand how cabin or cable shifters are changing 6 gears in a transaxle. Oh, cable shifters. Manual transmission, front-wheel drive cars, they usually use cables. And the way cables work, you got 2 cables, 6 gears, and reverse, is that as you move the gear lever back and forth, these cables rock back and forth or move a lever from side to side. So each one of them can do multiple tasks. It isn't just that they move in a straight line. They can also move a lever from side to side to change something inside the transmission. So that's one of the ways that they do it. Cables are not my favorite thing, but what the heck. Oh my goodness, we've done it one more time. Hope you found it interesting. Thanks for listening, and thanks to Steve McMillan, George Stockton, and Chris DePamphilis for producing today's show. For everyone here at Goss's Garage, I'm Pat Goss. Please, everybody, drive gently. See ya.